India has just done something rather extraordinary in the world of trade diplomacy, and it's worth paying very close attention to because it reveals exactly how the rest of the world has learned to handle Donald Trump. While the American president was busy threatening India with what he called reciprocal tariffs of up to 52%, New Delhi quietly assembled a response so precisely calibrated, so strategically elegant, that it essentially neutralized Trump's leverage before he even got to the negotiating table. And the way they did it exposes a fundamental weakness in Trump's entire approach to international trade that almost nobody in the mainstream press is talking about. What India understood, and what the Trump administration apparently still doesn't grasp, is that tariffs are not a weapon when the other side has already prepared the battlefield. By the end of this analysis, you'll understand exactly how India turned Trump's biggest threat into his most embarrassing negotiating failure, and why the playbook New Delhi just wrote is being studied by every major economy on Earth right now. So let's start with what actually happened. Trump had been signaling for months that India would face enormous tariffs, framing the country as one of America's worst offenders on trade. And to be fair, there was a kernel of truth buried beneath the bluster. India does maintain relatively high tariff barriers on certain goods. Average applied tariffs in India sit around 17% compared to roughly 3.5% in the United States. On specific products like motorcycles, the disparity has been even more dramatic, with Indian duties reaching as high as 100% on certain imported vehicles. Trump seized on these numbers with characteristic subtlety, declaring India the tariff king and promising that America would match whatever India charged, dollar for dollar, product for product. But here's where the story gets interesting, because India didn't do what Trump expected. They didn't bluster. They didn't threaten retaliation. They didn't engage in the kind of public chest thumping that would have given Trump exactly the confrontation he wanted. Instead, Prime Minister Modi's government did something far more strategically sophisticated. They began systematically dismantling Trump's negotiating position before formal talks even commenced. India's approach unfolded across several dimensions simultaneously, and each one deserves examination because together they represent perhaps the most comprehensive pre-negotiation strategy any country has deployed against this administration. The first move involved proactive tariff reductions. New Delhi began selectively cutting duties on American goods, targeting products with maximum symbolic and political value. Tariffs on American bourbon whiskey were reduced. Duties on certain American agricultural products came down. Harley-Davidson motorcycles, which Trump had personally fixated on as a symbol of unfair Indian trade practices, saw their tariff burden eased considerably. Each reduction was carefully chosen not for its economic significance, which in most cases was modest, but for its ability to undercut specific talking points Trump had been using to justify his threatened tariffs. Now, you might wonder why making concessions before negotiations even begin would be considered a strong move rather than a weak one. And this is where India's strategy reveals its real sophistication. What Modi's trade team understood is that Trump's tariff threats operate primarily as political theatre. The threatened tariffs were never really about achieving specific trade outcomes. They were about creating a narrative of American strength and foreign capitulation. India's preemptive concessions didn't weaken their position. They stole Trump's narrative entirely. By voluntarily reducing tariffs on the very products Trump kept mentioning, India made it impossible for him to claim a dramatic victory through confrontation. The concessions were already made. The story of Trump forcing India to bend was already written, except India had written it on their own terms. The Financial Times reported that Indian trade officials had spent months studying the patterns of Trump's previous trade confrontations, particularly the disastrous China negotiations and the bruising encounters with Canada and the European Union. What they identified was a consistent pattern. Trump escalates rhetorically, demands maximum concessions, then accepts far less than he demanded while declaring total victory. The key vulnerability in this approach is that Trump needs the appearance of confrontation followed by capitulation. Remove the confrontation, and the entire strategy collapses. And this is precisely what India did. Compare this to how other nations have responded to Trump's tariff threats, and the contrast is genuinely illuminating. Canada chose direct confrontation, matching American tariffs dollar for dollar and engaging in very public diplomatic warfare. The result was months of economic disruption, significant damage to both economies, and a resolution that left neither side genuinely better off. China initially attempted negotiation, then escalated to full trade war, resulting in hundreds of billions in tariffs that devastated global supply chains and produced no clear winner. The European Union oscillated between conciliation and retaliation, creating confused messaging that Trump exploited to divide European responses. India watched all of this and drew a remarkably clear lesson. The worst possible response to Trump's tariff strategy is the one he wants you to make. Retaliation gives him the enemy he needs. Capitulation under pressure gives him the victory photo. But preemptive strategic accommodation, voluntary movement on issues you are going to concede anyway, robs him of both the fight and the triumph. It's the geopolitical equivalent of stepping aside as someone charges at you and watching them stumble past into empty space. What makes India's approach even more impressive is the second dimension of their strategy, which involved offering Trump something he desperately needed on an entirely different front. While reducing tariffs to neutralize the immediate threat, India simultaneously positioned itself as the solution to one of America's most pressing strategic challenges, reducing dependence on Chinese manufacturing. Modi's government accelerated incentives for American companies looking to diversify supply chains away from China. Apple's expansion of iPhone manufacturing in India received high-profile government support. Defense procurement from American manufacturers was publicly highlighted. New Delhi essentially told Washington that India could be America's most valuable economic partner in the competition with China, but only if the relationship was built on cooperation rather than coercion. This was extraordinarily shrewd because it reframed the entire conversation. Instead of India being a trade adversary that needed to be punished, India became a strategic asset that needed to be cultivated. And the timing was impeccable. With American businesses increasingly nervous about Chinese supply chain exposure, with the semiconductor competition intensifying, and with Washington actively seeking to build alternative manufacturing centers in friendly nations, India's offer addressed real American strategic needs that tariff wars would actively undermine. The third dimension is perhaps the most underappreciated. India leveraged its enormous domestic market as a positive inducement rather than a defensive weapon. With nearly 1.4 billion consumers and a rapidly expanding middle class, India represents one of the largest growth opportunities for American businesses over the coming decades. Rather than threatening to restrict American access to this market, which would have been the retaliatory approach, India signaled increased openness for American investment and market entry. The message was unmistakable. Work with us and gain access to the world's fastest-growing major consumer market, or start a trade war and watch your competitors from Europe, Japan, and yes, China take your place. Or Bloomberg reported that American business leaders were privately lobbying the Trump administration to pursue a cooperative approach with India precisely because of these market access opportunities. When corporate America tells the White House that tariffs would hurt American businesses more than Indian ones, the political calculus shifts rapidly. Now, there's a critical element of this story that requires honest examination because India's approach wasn't without risk and isn't without genuine criticism. The tariff reductions India offered were, in absolute terms, relatively modest. India's overall tariff structure remains significantly higher than American levels, and many of the reductions targeted products with small bilateral trade volumes. Critics, including several economists quoted by Reuters, argued that India was offering symbolic gestures rather than substantive reform, essentially giving Trump shiny objects to claim as victories while preserving the structural protections that actually matter to Indian industry. And there's validity to this criticism. India remains deeply protectionist in sectors it considers strategically important, particularly agriculture, where tariff barriers protect hundreds of millions of Indian farmers from international competition. The dairy sector, the poultry sector, and rice production all maintain substantial protections that India has no intention of dismantling, regardless of American pressure. But here's what that criticism misses about the broader strategic picture. India's objective was never to achieve genuine free trade with the United States. The objective was to neutralize an immediate threat while preserving long-term strategic autonomy. And by that measure, the strategy has been remarkably successful. So what's driving the Trump administration's response to all this? And this is where the analysis becomes genuinely fascinating, because the administration's reaction reveals the fundamental incoherence at the heart of Trump's trade policy. On one hand, Trump's trade hawks, including figures who view tariffs as tools for reshaping global commerce, wanted to push ahead with punitive duties regardless of India's concessions. On the other hand, Trump's political advisors recognized that India was offering him something valuable, a narrative of diplomatic success without the economic pain of a trade war. The administration appeared genuinely uncertain how to respond to an adversary who was neither fighting nor surrendering, but instead elegantly sidestepping the entire confrontation. Reuters reported that internal discussions within the Trade Representative's office became notably confused once India began implementing preemptive reductions. The prepared talking points assumed Indian resistance. The economic modeling assumed retaliatory tariffs. The political strategy assumed a confrontation that would demonstrate American strength. When India simply declined to provide the confrontation, the entire framework needed revision. This connects to a broader pattern that anyone watching American trade policy should understand, because it reveals something important about how power actually functions in international relations. Trump's approach to trade assumes that American economic size automatically translates to American economic leverage. And in many bilateral contexts, that assumption holds. America is such an enormous market that most countries cannot afford to lose access to it. But leverage requires credible threats, and credible threats require willingness to accept mutual damage. India's strategy exposed the reality that in a trade war between the world's largest and fifth largest economies, the damage would flow in both directions, and American businesses knew it. The consequences of India's approach extend well beyond the immediate bilateral relationship, and this is where the implications become truly significant. What New Delhi has demonstrated is a replicable template for managing Trump's economic coercion. The formula involves three elements: preemptive concessions on symbolic issues that diffuse political narratives, strategic repositioning as an economic partner rather than adversary, and leveraging domestic market access as positive inducement. This template is being studied in capitals from Jakarta to Brasilia to Ankara, and it fundamentally changes the dynamics of American trade diplomacy. If enough nations adopt variations of India's approach, the entire foundation of Trump's tariff strategy erodes. Tariffs work as leverage only when they can be presented as responses to foreign intransigence. When potential targets preemptively accommodate, adjust, and redirect, the theatrical value of tariffs disappears and only the economic costs remain. American consumers paying higher prices for imported goods without corresponding political victories to justify the expense represents the worst possible outcome for an administration built on economic populism. There's a historical parallel worth examining here that illuminates why India's approach may prove more durable than it initially appears. During the Cold War, India pioneered the non-aligned movement, essentially refusing to accept the binary choice between American and Soviet alliance. That strategic independence frustrated both superpowers for decades, but ultimately served Indian interests by preserving freedom of action in an ideologically polarized world. What India is doing now with trade policy echoes that same strategic philosophy. Rather than accepting the binary choice between submission and confrontation that Trump's approach demands, India is charting a third path that preserves autonomy while managing risk. The question that should concern Washington is whether this moment represents the beginning of a broader shift in how the world responds to American economic power projection. For 75 years, American economic dominance was deployed primarily through multilateral institutions that gave other nations voice and stake in the system. The shift toward unilateral tariff threats as primary economic policy tools represents a fundamental departure from that model, and India's response suggests that the rest of the world is adapting far more quickly than Washington anticipated. Bringing all this together, what India has achieved is not merely a tactical success in one trade negotiation. It represents a strategic demonstration that Trump's tariff-based foreign policy contains a fundamental design flaw. The approach requires adversaries who behave predictably, who either capitulate under pressure or retaliate in kind, providing justification for escalation. India refused to play either role, and in doing so revealed that the emperor's leverage, shall we say, isn't quite as formidable as advertised. Modi's government understood something that seems to have eluded the Trump administration entirely. In the modern global economy, interdependence isn't weakness to be exploited, it's reality to be managed. India doesn't need to defeat America in a trade war. India needs to ensure there isn't one, while simultaneously positioning itself to capture the economic opportunities that American belligerence is creating elsewhere. And so far, that's exactly what they've done. The real story here isn't about tariff rates or trade deficits or bilateral negotiations. It's about a world learning, country by country, negotiation by negotiation, that American economic threats can be managed, deflected, and ultimately neutralized by governments willing to think strategically rather than react emotionally. When historians examine this period, they may well conclude that the most consequential development wasn't America imposing tariffs. It was the rest of the world discovering, through examples like India's, that those tariffs could be rendered largely meaningless by anyone clever enough to refuse the fight on Trump's terms. And that realization, once it fully takes hold across global capitals, will reshape international economic relations far more profoundly than any tariff schedule ever could.